Figuring out how long to cook pork roast in a crockpot can be tough, especially if you are using the pot for the first time. In this video, you'll learn the duration of time you need to cook pork roast in a crockpot. If you get a hang of these basics, you'd be able to easily follow any pork roast recipe. The basics of cooking pork roast in a crockpot. Settings and timing. Many crock pots have only two settings, which are the high and low settings. Most crockpot recipes require low setting because food cooks better when set on gentle heat over a long time. But, if you don't have enough prep time, you can resort to using the high setting. When choosing these settings, bear in mind that there are several factors that affect how long a food item should cook. These factors include the following: the fat content of the meat used, the density of the meat, liquid content, type of vegetables used and the size, the overall quantity of the food. With these factors, whatever cooking time recommended is only an approximate guide. You may still have to try out different timings and settings with your own crock pot. Going from high setting to low. Even with the difference in pot setting, on the low setting, it takes at least 7 to 8 hours for food to reach boiling point, but takes half of that time in high setting. An approximate way of going from high setting to low or in reverse is to divide or multiply the initial time by 1.5 to 2.5 hours. Food would cook as they are layered. Since the heating element of most crock pots is underneath, the food at the bottom would cook faster. So, layer the food in order of their density and how long they require to cook. For pork roast recipes, the meat would be at the bottom of the pot, then you layer on other ingredients. Here are some factors to bear in mind when cooking pork roast in a crock pot. Setting the pot in relation to the cooking time. Most crockpot pork roast recipes call for the low setting. This lower temperature allows the meat to cook for long and soften as the fat melts off. A 3 to 4 pound pork roast would take about 8 hours to cook on low and a little over 5 hours to cook on high. Type of cut of meat. The best type of roast to cook in a crock pot is the tough and fatty roasts. These types of cut get more tender the longer they cook, whereas the leaner cuts of meat would dry out. The boneless variety of meat would also take less time to cook than the cut with bone. That's because the bone takes up more time to heat than the meat on it. Trim your pork roast. Most newbies make the mistake of not trimming the fat out of their pork roast. The best pork roast recipes are those that have their meat fat trimmed off. After trimming the cut of meat, tie it. If this is too much work for you, ask your butcher to trim and tie the meat for you. Season the meat properly. Because pork roast is thick with deep layers, you need to season it properly, or else the interior would come out flavorless. The best way to ensure that the seasoning permeates every part of the meat is to rub in generous quantities of whatever seasoning you choose to use. Then place the meat in a Ziploc bag and leave it overnight in the fridge. If you are pressed for time and cannot marinate the meat overnight, then let it sit for no less than half an hour. Shape and size of the roast. You'd agree that it makes sense for a larger cut of meat to take more time to cook. However, it is not only the weight of the meat that matters. The shape of the meat can also affect how long it would need to cook. A cut of meat that is flat and wide would cook faster than a cut of meat of the same weight that is almost round-shaped. That's because heat would pass faster to the center of the flat and wide meat cut than the round one. The heat would need to pass through a thicker mass of meat to reach the center of the round-shaped meat. This would definitely make the cooking time longer. How full to pack your crock pot? Usually, the standard thing is to add some veggies and roots to the pork roast. But if you are not careful, you would fill the pot beyond its capacity. And when you do, this would make the pork roast stay longer than the recipe calls for. So, you should check out the maximum capacity recommended by the manufacturer. Experts advise that you should not hit that maximum capacity. They advise you to stay between the minimum capacity and the maximum. That way, you would get a perfectly cooked pork roast. If you are always cooking large crockpot recipes, then consider buying the large size so that you would not have to overstuff your pot. The type and quantity of liquid you start out with. When using your crock pot, the best liquids to use in place of water include broth, wine, or other liquor. Avoid liquids such as milk. The slow cooker does not require as much water or liquid as your regular cookware. So always remember to use less water, liquid than regular. Do not add dairy products too early into the cooking time. Following the point about milk, always remember that you do not add dairy products at the beginning of your cooking time. Always leave it till the ending of the cooking time. If you add dairy products early, they'll curdle and make a mess of your recipe. Stick to the quantity of wine or liqueur stipulated in the recipe. When you cook with your regular pot on the stovetop, alcohol or wine would boil down and reduce, leaving the food with a subtle hint of the liqueur used. That is not the case with a slow cooker or crock pot. Since the wine or liqueur you add to a crockpot recipe does not boil down, you need to be careful. The best way to save yourself the heartache of having a pork roast dinner with an overwhelming taste of liqueur is to adhere strictly to what is called for in the recipe. Another method is using the liqueur called for in your recipe to deglaze the pan you used to sear the pork roast. Then you add it to the ingredients. Peeking into the pot while cooking. You might be tempted to peek into your pot to check out what's cooking. But this is not a good move. That's because every time you open the lid of the pot, you are letting out heat and steam, which in turn lowers the temperature while increasing the cooking time. Experts say that you add as much as 20 minutes or more to the cooking time. So set the cooking time and go do something else. Design of the pot. The design of the cover of your crock pot can impact how long the pork roast would cook. The tighter the lid, the more steam and heat are locked in. Crock pots that have a rubber seal around the cover do better at locking in steam and heat. Your pork roast would cook faster in such a pot. Always use a food kitchen thermometer. If you are really serious about preparing excellent pork roast recipes at all times, then you need a kitchen thermometer. This would ensure that you cook your meat to the right degree of doneness. Remember that since some cuts of meat would be thicker than the other, they would not all get cooked at the same time. That's where the thermometer comes in for you to check and be sure. Expert tips on how to cook pork roast with your slow cooker. Since crock pot is a brand of slow cooker, many people use the term crock pot and slow cooker interchangeably. For this reason, most tips that you see for slow cookers would work for crock pots. So the following are some expert tips to follow for cooking your pork roast in a crock pot. Some of these tips would also come in handy for other meat or food items. Because there are many brands of slow cookers out there. It only makes good sense that you read the manufacturer's instructions on how to use it. It's best to start out with meat that's been thawed out or fresh fish. This is because frozen meat would increase the time it would take for the pot to build up pressure and make the meat stay longer than the safe time recommended. Start out the cooking of your meat on high. Leave it there for about an hour, then turn it to low for the remaining cooking time. Your crock pot requires liquid to build up the steam and pressure that would cook the food. So, always add at least 1 cup of liquid to your pot when you cook. Some people however argue that some food would produce juice, liquid on their own, but it's better to err on the side of caution. Cut your meat into chunks instead of large cuts. Always ensure that your meat reaches an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. One sure way to know the duration to cook pork roast in your crockpot is to try out different recipes. Throw the ingredients into the crockpot, set it and go about your daily business. Come back much later to see how well cooked it is, and that's it. If you've enjoyed this video, click the subscribe button below. Hit the notification bell so you'll know once we post a new video. Also, drop a comment below so we can know your thoughts. Finally, don't forget to check the description below for more details. Visit our site hotpots4u.com for more awesome cookpot tips like this.